Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take the source material you're interested in articles, videos, notes, and we really dig in.
Yeah, our goal is to pull out the key insights, the stuff that really matters, so you can get informed quickly on complex topics. We sort of cut through the noise for you.
Exactly. Think of it as your shortcut. And today, we've got a fascinating source. It's a transcript from an MSNBC video.
Right, and it gives a very specific viewpoint on what's been happening recently, protests, political moves, the whole dynamic.
It really does paint a distinct picture. So our mission today is to unpack that picture for you. What tensions does it highlight? How does it describe resistance, public feeling?
And we'll get into some pretty specific details mentioned, claims about deploying the military, legal fights, some really strong language being used.
And even, yeah, a moment the source itself kind of flags as, well, funny, which we'll definitely touch on.
So let's dive in. The source starts by framing things as an arm wrestle.
An arm wrestle, okay, suggests a real struggle. Who are the sides in this arm wrestle, according to this transcript?
Well, on one side, you've got what the source calls Donald Trump's desire to subjugate the country under his rule. Strong words.
Yeah, very strong. And the other side?
That's described as the people's desire to not be governed unilaterally by a king. So it's this fundamental clash, and the source basically uses it as a lens to view a lot of recent events.
Okay, so a perceived push for absolute power versus a popular pushback. And the source doesn't just state this, right? He gives specific examples it sees as evidence of overreach.
Absolutely. Los Angeles comes up first, the deployment of the National Guard there.
And the source makes a point of saying this was against the wishes of the state Democratic governor. That seems important to their framing.
It is. And, the transcript notes that a district court judge actually struck down that specific use of the Guard just yesterday.
Oh, wow. So a legal check.
Yes, though they apparently remained pending an appeal. But then, and this is key, the source points to something else happening at the same time. 200 Marines into California.
Marines.
Oh, yeah.
That's different. That's not the Guard.
No, exactly. And the source calls it an enormous escalation, makes it very clear not to confuse the two. Deploying active duty Marines domestically, the source notes, is highly unusual, even in unrest. It really hammers this point.
And then there's that specific anecdote, the one from Reuters.
Yeah, this really drives the point home. According to the Reuters report cited, those Marines detained at least one person at the federal building they were guarding.
Okay, and who was this person?
The source specifies a veteran who was going to an appointment at the Department of Veterans Affairs, and apparently he accidentally crossed a yellow line.
Wow, a veteran going to the VA, detained for crossing a line, according to the source. That's a powerful image they're painting there.
It really is. It's used to illustrate this idea of, arbitrary power hitting even someone you wouldn't expect for something minor.
Okay. What other examples does the source use to build this case of perceived overreach?
It moves on to the case of Mahmoud Khalil.
Right, described as a recent Columbia graduate student, a legal resident, a green card holder, and, importantly, not been charged with any crime. So, legally present in the U.S.
Exactly. And according to this account, he was snatched from his home in front of his then 9-month pregnant wife.
Oh, my goodness.
And then imprisoned for 3 months over his protected political speech protesting Israel's war in Gaza. That's how the source frames the reason for his initial detention.
And there were legal challenges to this.
Yes. The source says the DOJ wouldn't release him even after a federal judge determined he cannot be deported or detained based on that first reason, given something about his very presence being a national security threat.
So a judge pushed back on the initial justification, but he wasn't released.
That's what the source reports. Then the government apparently shifted gears, saying he's now held for a different reason, something about a discrepancy in his green card application.
A paperwork issue.
Right. And the source notes the judge declined to block detention based on that, at least thus far. But the transcript makes its interpretation very clear. Mahmoud Khalil was not arrested and detained over a paperwork dispute. It stresses the sequence detained for speech first, then held on paperwork.
Very pointed sequencing there. Okay, so we have examples involving civilians. Does the source mention incidents involving elected officials?
It does. It claims federal agents manhandled a United States senator, forced him to the ground, and handcuffed him.
A U.S. senator. Why?
Apparently, after he tried to ask a question at a press conference held by Trump's Homeland Security Director, Kristi Noem, and the source pulls a specific quote from Noem at that press conference.
What did she allegedly say,
Yeah.
according to this transcript?
The source quotes her as admitting the military presence in LA was explicitly for political and ideological purposes. Specifically, she reportedly said it was to liberate them from the socialist governing class there.
Liberate them from the socialist governing class. Wow, that's direct. As presented by the source, that ties military action directly to politics. Fits their arm wrestle idea.
It certainly does, and the source adds this is the same government that tried to forcibly prevent a United States Congresswoman from exercising basic and legally protected oversight in an ICE detention facility in her district.
Tried to stop her doing oversight.
That's the claim. And then the source says they charged the same Congresswoman with federal crimes for trying.
So the picture is veteran detained, legal resident held, senator manhandled, Congresswoman blocked and charged. Quite a list. And the source notes something about visibility.
Yeah, it emphasizes these things happen all in front of witnesses, all in front of cameras. The implication seems to be that these aren't hidden actions, maybe even meant to be seen.
Okay, so pulling these together, the military moves, the detentions, the clashes with officials, the source uses these to argue that one side of the arm wrestle is using power aggressively, maybe unusually and definitely politically. This is the subjugate side of the conflict as they see it.
Exactly. It's laying out the evidence for that perceived push for unilateral power. Then the source shifts gears a bit.
To upcoming events, and maybe the other side of that arm wrestle.
Precisely. It focuses on the planned military parade in D.C.
Right. Described pretty starkly, North Korean style, Soviet style, something the source says we just don't do outside of, like, major war victories. Mentions the Gulf War Parade as the exception.
Correct. And the timing is noted, too. It just so happens to fall on his 79th birthday. Plus, it's linked to fundraising.
Ah, yes, the fundraising email.
Yeah.
And this is where the source finds a bit of unintentional humor, right?
It does. It quotes the subject line verbatim. Please help me before my military parade.
Please help me before my military parade. You know, the source points out it's funny. And yeah, describing a state military event as my parade and needing help before it. It's just very personal phrasing for a national event. It really does stand out.
It definitely fits the source's narrative about perceived personal rule. And alongside this planned parade, the source highlights the reported stance on protests.
What's reported there?
Trump reportedly already promised, quote, very heavy force against anyone who would choose to protest his special day. And the source stresses this was aimed at protesters generally, not just rioters or looters.
Heavy force against protesters. And there was some other intense rhetoric mentioned from Florida.
Yeah, really intense, quoting an official there about throwing things or pointing a gun. We will be notifying your family where to collect your remains at because we will kill you, graveyard dead, and telling drivers if threatened to just drive regardless of the threats.
Wow, graveyard dead.
That's chilling language. It is, and the source presents this as the backdrop to the parade, but then it immediately contrasts this with what else is planned.
The counter-protests.
Exactly. Described as an enormous, peaceful protest scheduled for tomorrow, all across the country from coast to coast. It mentions international solidarity protests, too. And the message...
No, king's not ever.
That's the one. So you have the parade and the forceful rhetoric versus these huge peaceful protests. The source basically says this coming period is the arm wrestle in action.
Okay, and the source argues this resistance isn't just symbolic. It represents real public opinion, and it's having an effect.
Yes, definitely. The perspective is clear. People are not just going to roll over. It mentions an organization waging nonviolence.
What about them?
The source says they track organized nonviolent protests and seems to really value their data.
And what does that data show, according to the source?
It claims protests in 2025 are far outpacing the same metric during Trump's first term. So the source sees this as evidence of more mass mobilization happening now.
And beyond organized protests, it mentions sort of everyday public feeling, particularly about immigration.
That's right. Hearing dozens a day from regular people, all kinds of backgrounds, even people who voted for Trump, who are unhappy with the indiscriminate mass deportation scheme.
Indiscriminate? What kind of examples does it give?
Things like deporting friends and family members and their neighbors and their co-workers. It mentions authorities chasing people through strawberry fields, deporting people who've been here for decades, people with kids, grandkids here.
So the argument is, this isn't just political opponents reacting, it's hitting communities broadly and causing concern even among some supporters. And it backs this with polling.
It does. Cites Quinnipiac showing Trump underwater by double digits on both immigration issues and deportations, and Reuters finding voters think, by a margin of 9 points, that Trump has gone too far with deportations.
And the polling also touched on those specific incidents, right? Like
Yeah.
arresting officials or the LA situation.
Yeah, Reuters again. Voters reportedly disapprove of the government arresting local officials who interfere in immigration enforcement by 14 points, and disapprove of how Trump has handled the Los Angeles protests by 15 points. The source also throws in an overall approval rating cited 38-37%.
Okay, so the source marshals this polling to say, look, the specific actions we're highlighting as overreach, they're actually unpopular with the average voter, which, they argue, cuts against any narrative that these actions represent the people.
Exactly. And it talks about how the administration projects supreme confidence, and maybe the media sometimes buys into that projection of dominance.
But the source says the numbers tell a different story.
Right. Based on the polling it presents, the source argues that actually these actions doesn't look good to the median voter, which is why, the source argues, the visible popular resistance is so important.
To counter the narrative.
Precisely. To push back against what it calls the myth that the administration speaks for everyone, and opponents are just fringe, marginal weirdos. The source uses the protest tracking, the anecdotes, the polling, all of it, to argue the resistance is broad, growing, and maybe more aligned with the mainstream than you'd think.
So resistance is happening. It's significant. It reflects public feeling, according to this source. Does it claim this resistance actually works? Are there examples?
Yes, it highlights what it calls small victories along the way. The case of Kilmer Garcia comes up again.
He was the one deported?
Right, to El Salvador. The source says he's now reportedly back in the United States, released from that mega prison there after months of protests.
And the source notes this happened even after the administration supposedly said he was never coming back.
That's the emphasis. And Garcia reportedly got a day in court, a U.S. court, where he pleaded not guilty and will get due process. The source directly credits sustained pressure for this outcome.
Okay, that's one example. Any others?
Changes to legislation. It reports Senate Republicans have altered a portion of Trump's bill that would have limited the court's ability to rein him in.
And why did they change it, according to the source?
Because folks across the country showed up to town halls to tell the representatives about that provision. So, direct citizen action at town halls having an impact on a Senate bill.
Interesting. So these examples are meant to show the people side of the arm wrestle can win concessions, that the pushback isn't pointless.
Exactly. It suggests resistance can yield results, even small ones, which is important for morale and keeping the pressure on.
And finally, the source comes back to the motivation. Why is this resistance happening?
It loops back to that no kings idea. It quotes an organizer saying it's because they are overreaching, using full force in unexpected places, elementary schools, at Home Depots, even reportedly going to parks, picking up nannies to deport undocumented people.
And there's a really stark claim about who's being targeted.
Yeah, a very direct quote. What we're seeing across this country is them targeting anyone who looks like me, anyone who is Latino or brown and beyond in this moment.
That's a powerful claim about the nature of the enforcement and the source's final takeaway on motivation.
It's pretty blunt. No one is coming to save us. In an authoritarian breakthrough, the only backstop is US, the people. It frames resistance not just as political, but as fundamentally necessary.
Okay, so pulling it all together, this source paints a picture of, well, that arm wrestle, escalating tension between perceived unilateral power grabs shown through military actions, legal fights, incidents with officials, and a growing, broad-based popular resistance.
And crucially, the source argues this resistance isn't just noise. It uses data, stories, polling to say it reflects mainstream opinion, it crosses political lines, and it's actually achieving some things, forcing small changes. It presents this popular resistance as the vital counterweight right now.
So, as you process this deep dive into the source's perspective, here are a few things to think about. What does this specific account, with its focus on mobilization, resistance, and those small victories, tell you about how power and public action might be interacting right now? If that military parade and the No Kings protests happen, as the source describes, how could that juxtaposition encapsulate the larger conflict this source is trying to outline? And finally, consider the impact of those specific stories as the veteran, the legal resident. How does the source use these personal examples to potentially shape opinion within the narrative it's constructing?
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.